Imagine stepping into one of the most dazzling palaces the world has ever seen. Gilded walls, sparkling chandeliers stretching from floor to ceiling, and enough silk and satin to clothe the continent. It's the 17th century, and you're inside the Palace of Versailles, the epicenter of royal luxury in France. But take a deep breath. Suddenly, it hits you. A smell so vile, it could knock the powdered wig clean off your head. It's not the horses. It's not the gardens. It's the palace itself. Welcome to Versailles, where glamour met grime, elegance danced with excrement, and being a royal lady wasn't all pearls and perfume. Today, we're diving headfirst metaphorically, thank goodness, into the shockingly disgusting hygiene habits of noblewomen in one of the most opulent yet unsanitary places in history. These are the 5 worst hygiene horrors of royal women. And believe me, you're not ready. If you were a noblewoman in 17th century France, you were expected to embody grace, poise, and the fashion sense of the gods. But when it came to personal hygiene, that was a very different story. Today, bathing is the ultimate symbol of cleanliness and self-care. But back then, it was considered risky, even dangerous. Why? Because the prevailing medical wisdom, if you can call it that, claimed that warm water opened your pores, leaving you vulnerable to disease floating in the air. Bathhouses, once popular during the Roman Empire, had become associated with sin and sexual immorality. The church wasn't helping either. Religious leaders warned that too much bathing was indulgent, prideful, even sinful. Cleanliness of the soul was what mattered, not the body. And so public bathhouses were closed down and personal washing became rare. So what did the elite ladies of the French court do instead of bathing? They spot cleaned. Not with warm soapy water, but with damp cloths. And not even damp with water, sometimes it was alcohol, vinegar, or even saliva. Yep, saliva. Supposedly, that helped keep things clean without inviting death in through your pores. Full-body baths were extremely rare, and when they did happen, it was usually a shared affair. One tub, one batch of water. Everyone took turns. And of course, the men went first. By the time a woman got her turn, the water was cloudy, lukewarm, and full of, let's call it, family residue. That is, if there was any water left at all. Now multiply that by hundreds of royals and courtiers, all crammed into one palace. And what do you get? A smell that made visitors gag. Literally. Travelers often wrote home complaining about the thick, sour air that clung to Versailles. It was a blend of perfume, body odor, old food, and mildew. From a distance, the royal women looked flawless. Silks, diamonds, powdered faces, and towering wigs. But up close, the scent told a much different story. These women were the picture of beauty right up until you stood next to them. So we've covered bathing, or the lack of it. Now let's talk about the second hygiene horror, using the bathroom. Because as grand as Versailles was, it barely had any working toilets. This palace wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Louis XIV, the Sun King, wanted the world to see France as the height of civilization, wealth, and power. So he built a fantasy, a dream, a shimmering mirage made of gold leaf and mirrors. But guess what he didn't build? Toilets. The palace was constructed for display, not function. It wasn't designed with plumbing, sewage systems, or airflow in mind. Every decision was about appearance, symmetry, grandeur, dominance, not comfort or practicality or cleanliness. A palace with over 2,000 rooms, home to thousands of people, and yet almost no proper bathrooms. Instead, noblewomen relied on chamber pots, basically fancy buckets tucked under beds, behind curtains, or even in closets. And what happened once the pot was full? Someone, and it often wasn't a servant, would toss the contents out the window, straight onto the gardens, the walkways, or unfortunately sometimes other people. The wind, of course, didn't always cooperate. It gets worse. Some courtiers, especially men, didn't even bother with the pots. They'd simply urinate off balconies or relieve themselves in palace corners or gardens. Visitors from other countries were horrified. This wasn't just the occasional rude guest, it was a full-blown systemic problem. The corridors of Versailles were so infamous for their, let's say, accidents, that in 1715 the king had to pass a law ordering that the palace halls be cleaned once a week, not daily, once a week, and that was considered an improvement. So picture this, you're a noblewoman floating down the marble hallway in your layers of embroidered satin. But instead of worrying about your perfume or your posture, you're carefully lifting your skirts to avoid stepping in someone else's mess. And here's another kicker, there was no toilet paper. Not even close. People used cloth scraps, straw, leaves, or in some cases their bare hands. And hand washing. That was minimal, if at all. So if you're wondering why disease spread like wildfire, now you know. Let's move on to the hair. Because if Versailles had a fashion signature, it was the wigs. Specifically, those enormous, elaborate, gravity-defying hairstyles of noblewomen. These things were architectural. They weren't just hair, they were statements. Wigs could reach feet above a woman's scalp and were decorated with pearls, feathers, silk flowers, even miniature ships. Yes, actual tiny ships riding the powdered waves of curls. To create these masterpieces, women didn't just roll out of bed and grab a comb. They used wire frames, horsehair, wool padding, and then smothered the whole thing in pomade. Not your favorite coconut-scented leave-in conditioner, but animal fat. Usually beef tallow. Why the fat? It helped mold the wig and keep the style in place, but it also turned a woman's scalp into prime real estate for lice. These hairpieces were almost never cleaned, and they weren't removed often either because getting them on and off was a massive ordeal. Yes, some women would literally pause mid-conversation or mid-toast to discreetly claw at their infested scalps. They'd do it with grace and poise, of course, after all, fashion was everything. Everything was performative, your outfit, your manners, your hair, your posture. And falling out of fashion meant losing access, influence, and sometimes even survival. And these wigs weren't just gross, they were dangerous. The sheer weight caused chronic neck and back pain. Some even caught fire if a woman got too close to a candle. But to show up at court without one, social suicide, you could lose favor, status, and reputation faster than you could say Marie Antoinette. So while poor women often shaved their heads to avoid lice, noblewomen lived with the crawling, the itching, and the smell because their hair was their crown, even if it was hiding an entire ecosystem. Let's keep going, because we're not done peeling back the layers of powdered perfection just yet. We've already covered the lack of bathing, the horror show toilets, and the lice-ridden wigs. But if you thought food was a safe zone in royal life, think again. When we picture Versailles, we often imagine long tables overflowing with roasted pheasants, glazed pastries, towers of fruit, and endless goblets of wine. And yes, the French royal court did know how to throw a feast. But behind the scenes, it was a stomach-churning disaster. The Palace of Versailles had no real plumbing, which meant raw sewage often found its way into places it absolutely should not have gone, like the kitchens. That's not an exaggeration. There are records of wastewater backing up into the Queen's private kitchen. Imagine preparing an elaborate royal meal next to a puddle of, well, human waste. Refrigeration? Didn't exist. Proper ventilation? Laughable. Pest control? Non-existent. So what did all this mean for the food? Meat spoiled. Vegetables rotted. Flies multiplied. Rats feasted. But the cook still had to serve 3 lavish meals a day, which means spoiled meat and moldy fruit still made it to the royal table, often covered up with extra seasoning, extra sugar, or extra fat just to mask the smell. So yes, the food looked amazing, but it was often crawling with bacteria or worse, worms. Royal courtiers routinely suffered from intestinal parasites, the most notorious being tapeworms. These could grow to several inches or feet inside the body. It was so common that even King Louis XIV himself reportedly passed a 6-inch long tapeworm. Can you imagine being at a royal ball, dressed in embroidered silk, making polite conversation, while your insides are being slowly devoured by a parasite? And yet, eating was a performance. Royal women were expected to dine with elegance. That meant small, delicate bites, polite laughter, toasts, flirting, and hosting, all while silently enduring cramps, nausea, or worse. Many of them did just that, pushing through dinner parties with forced smiles while their stomachs waged war. And now we arrive at what might be the most intimate, and horrifying aspect of royal womanhood, childbirth. For most women today, childbirth is private, sacred, and supported by trained professionals. But in 17th century France, it was theatrical, literal spectacle. When a queen or any high-ranking noblewoman went into labor, the birthing chamber became a public arena. We're talking dozens of people packed into the room: noblemen, court ladies, physicians, midwives, clergymen, and curious onlookers, all gathered to watch. Why? Because royal births had to be witnessed. People feared baby-swapping scandals. What if the queen gave birth to a stillborn, or a daughter, and the court tried to replace her with a male heir? To prevent that, everything had to happen in full view. It wasn't about offering help or support, it was about surveillance. So imagine you're in agony, screaming through contractions, drenched in sweat, exhausted, terrified, and a room full of well-dressed aristocrats is watching your every movement like it's opening night at the theater. When Queen Marie Therese gave birth, the room was so crammed that one observer compared it to a market square. The heat was unbearable, the noise constant, and the pressure immense. Marie Antoinette herself famously fainted after giving birth, overwhelmed by the combination of heat, pain, and an audience that refused to leave. She wasn't alone. Many royal women lost consciousness or suffered medical complications, all while being stared at like exhibits. And remember, there were no antibiotics, no sterilized tools, no proper pain relief, just prayer, luck, and a very real risk of death. In fact, 1 in 3 children born at court died before their 3rd birthday, and maternal mortality was tragically common. Infections from unwashed hands, contaminated instruments, or prolonged labor claimed many lives, but royal duty didn't care. A queen's job was to produce heirs, preferably male ones, and failure to do so could cost her status, affection, or even her position. Behind every grand portrait of a serene royal mother holding her baby, there's an untold story of pain, trauma, and the unbearable pressure of giving birth, not just for a family, but for an entire nation. So there you have it. 5 revolting realities about what it meant to be a royal woman in the golden age of Versailles. It's easy to laugh at all of this now. Chamber pots under beds, lice parties on your scalp, banquet tables full of parasites, it almost sounds like satire. But for the women who lived it, it was anything but funny. They were trapped in a system that worshipped image but ignored health, expected to birth children in front of an audience, expected to endure physical agony for fashion, expected to serve as symbols of national pride while their own needs were dismissed or denied. And they did it all while covered in silks and powdered like porcelain dolls. Royal life wasn't just difficult, it was inhuman at times. And nowhere is that clearer than in how these women were forced to live. They looked like queens, but they suffered in silence. Versailles didn't smell like roses. It smelled like oppression, neglect, and rot hiding under 1,000 layers of perfume. Final thoughts. When history gets too pretty. So what do we take away from all this? History has a habit of romanticizing royalty. We imagine crowns and ballrooms and love stories. But the truth, it's often messier, dirtier, darker. The women of Versailles weren't just fashion icons. They were survivors of a system that valued beauty over well-being and illusion over truth. They smiled through lice. They ate spoiled meat. They gave birth in theaters. And they walked polished marble floors while dodging piles of human waste. That's the real story. So next time you see a painting of a French noblewoman, perfectly styled and dripping in diamonds, remember, she probably hadn't bathed in months. She might have had a live ecosystem in her wig. She might have just fainted after giving birth in front of 24 spectators. She wasn't just a portrait. She was a person, living in a palace of gold and surviving in a world of filth.